where are we today? A big focus on the south of Ukraine, isn't there?
Yes, this is exactly 2 weeks since the beginning of the Ukrainian offensive, and it's all shaping operations at the moment. They're still probing in 3 or 4 different places. But today, reports at Henichesk of this big ammunition dump being blown up, which is entirely plausible because the Ukrainians are looking for all of the rear area stocks that they can get that the Russians may have. And, of course, the Russians are doing the same to the Ukrainians. So that's entirely likely. More interesting, in a way, or just as interesting, is at Novokakhovka, there are lots of reports, still unconfirmed, but there are lots of these reports, that the Ukrainians may have crossed the river, presumably upstream of the dam that was blown on the 6th of June. And if they've crossed the river in any force, that is very interesting, because there's a big battle developing between Orikhiv and Tokmak. The Ukrainians are south of Orikhiv now, and they're trying to widen the front. Now, in the scheme of things, these are quite small operations, but nevertheless, they're trying to widen the front, and I think they're trying to stretch the Russians. If they've crossed the river, then I think that part of the idea behind that is because the Russians withdrew quite a lot of troops from this area after they blew the dam, the Ukrainians may be trying to persuade them to have to put troops back there to cover that and take troops away from this area where they're now fighting. If the Russians don't choose to do that and just risk it, then they may be risking letting the Ukrainians build up a force, a significant force, and open up a new area. Whether that will turn out to be the case or not, I'm fairly convinced that the Ukrainians are now beginning to fan out a little bit, and they're trying to pull the Russians away from certain concentrations to see where the gaps open up.
I see. One thing I find very interesting, NATO's got this new centre, hasn't it, which isn't too far from where we are, designed to protect undersea pipelines, cables.
Yep, it's going to be based at Northwood, which is the Maritime Command Centre. It's the British Maritime Command Centre, but it also works for NATO. It's the most important command centre this side of the Atlantic within NATO. And so this new centre is to deal with this sort of thing. This is the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines that were blown up on the 26th of September last year. NATO has been worrying about this for about a decade now, the vulnerability of undersea pipelines and particularly internet cables. Now, obviously, pipelines, gas and oil pipelines, they're pretty big things. You've got to blow them up to interrupt them. Undersea cables are much easier to interrupt. And NATO is now beginning to give a lot of thought to building more ships and keeping an eye on what the Russians are doing, because the Russians have been spying on all these cables. They've been sending spy ships to hang around in some key areas, and we've been tracking them doing that, or our countries have been tracking them doing it. And so NATO has now set up this command centre in Britain to try to coordinate what it's going to do. We
mentioned yesterday, didn't we, these nuclear warheads being set in Belarus. Clearly, Lukashenko can't do anything with them. They're under control of the Russians. Any movement on that today? Yeah, well, it's another bit of rhetoric. I mean, this is Putin when he was meeting Ramaphosa when the group of African nations visited him yesterday. And he took the opportunity there, again, to make the point that nuclear weapons are going into Belarus, and they've been talking about this since March this year, so it's no surprise. And it makes no operational difference. These weapons are under Russian control. They just happen to be based in Belarus. But Joe Biden has made it very clear this is reckless. This is reckless talk. And in saying that, he's only echoing what Xi Jinping of China has said and what a lot of African leaders have said, is that the person who's doing all the reckless talk is Putin and people around him. They're the only ones talking about nuclear escalation and nuclear dangers of this crisis. This crisis is not nuclear in any respect, but they keep raising the spectre of nuclear weapons in order to frighten everybody into feeling that the crisis is out of control in some way. All right, Michael, for now, many thanks indeed.